So thanks again. We've got, my name is Heidi Uhing. I'm the Public Policy Director for Civic, Nebraska. That's a statewide nonprofit housed in Lincoln that focuses on creating a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. We've got a couple of folks joining us as presenters today. Our first is Rachel Gibson from the League. If you want to give everybody a wave, you'll be hearing more from her in a minute. And then we've got Gavin Geis from Common Cause Nebraska. These are folks who spend a lot of time at the Capitol and have a deep understanding of how the legislative rules can impact our legislative process and therefore our resulting public policy as it goes through our legislature. So thanks again for your interest in this very wonky topic. Frankly, we were all surprised to see the number of folks volunteering your evening to join us on this subject. One of the challenges that we come across when trying to talk about the rules or kind of get the public involved when the need arises is that the legislative rules are so wonky and so sort of insider baseball that a lot of folks kind of glaze over when we talk about them. So we'll try to break them down in a way that's really understandable this evening. And again, thanks for your interest in this. We've got a really critical week in the legislature ahead of us related to this topic. So we're grateful for your interest. Gavin, would you like to start us off just kind of giving some big picture, what the legislative rules are for, what they've been like in previous years, and maybe how we've gotten ourselves into this situation where the legislative rules are suddenly something that we need to let the public know about?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you, Heidi. Happy to start us off. So, hey, everybody, Gavin Geis here with Common Cause. See a lot of people on the call here tonight that know a little bit about this subject or a lot about this subject. So I will try to cover it as broadly as possible, although there's a few of you on here who I know more than I do. So yes, no, I will do my best. Anyway, yes, so Gavin Geis, for those who don't know me, with an organization called Common Cause, we work on good government, which is voting rights and campaign finance and all the stuff that go along with democracy. I've been in this role for the past 10 years, and over that time have followed legislative rules in one way or another, and so have a little bit of a history that I can share experience and how it's changed. Broadly speaking, what legislative rules are just the rules that govern a legislature. Every state has some version of legislative rules, much like every public body, every elected body has a set of rules that govern their business. All the way from a school board up to a legislature to Congress, everybody has a set of rules that govern how they go about legislating. And in Nebraska, those are the legislative rules. I would be shocked if any two states had the exact same set of legislative rules. Everybody has different rules and procedures that we think are best for them. That is especially the case here in Nebraska. Being a nonpartisan one-house legislature makes our rules unique. They have to be unique in many ways, simply because we're trying to carry out a form of state government that no one else is. And so some of our rules don't look like the other 49 states, and that's okay. We'll actually be discussing quite a few of those here tonight. To go step backwards just a little bit, right? Today we're talking about legislative rule proposals that are being hotly contested in the legislature that are going to be very, very strongly debated from both sides, proponents and opponents. But going back in time, 10 years ago, legislative rules were not the hotly contested issue they are today. 10 years ago, legislative rules happened. They existed. There was still the Rules Committee, which is the body within the legislature that oversees proposals of changes to the rules, right? So we have a Rules Committee that looks at the proposals. Senators can bring ideas forward. That committee reviews them and then sends them to the floor for full debate and a vote. That has always been true. But 10 years ago, the Legislative Rules Committee was mostly unknown. There is actually not strong requirements for public notice and for public hearing within the Rules Committee itself. For many years, you would have to dig to find out when the committee was meeting. You'd have to have an insider that could tell you they're meeting at this time in this room, but public notice wasn't necessarily that prevalent. And so many of these rules hearings kind of went without much press coverage or without many of the public in the room. I was there many times to hear how they were talking about redistricting and other issues, but really, it was not the issue and it was not the fight that it is today. Now, saying that, there have certainly been fights over the rules in the history of the legislature. This is not the very first time there's been fights over many of the same issues that we're talking about today, right? Many of the introductions that are being debated today have been introduced and argued over for decades, right? Whether we have public votes, just the character and the nature of the unicameral have been debated within the rules, but it was not as public and it was not as big of a debate as it has become. Much of that changed in 2017 when the Rules Committee, for the first time in a long time, sent out a revision to make votes for committee chairs public, right? That's one of the rules we'll be talking about today. But in 2017, revisions were sent out that a large portion of the body found egregious, right? And so we had days and days and days of debate. That legislative session was largely derailed because of how hotly debated it was. And like I said, for the first time, it was about the rules that derailed legislative session. Not ever before had we seen that type of debate on the rules. So yes, 2017 is the year when things changed. And then since then, we have continued to see, I will say, a faction within the legislature pushing for rules changes that are intended to change the nature and the character of the unicameral. We see this each session in one way or another, but over the past couple sessions, over the past 3-4 sessions, this has just become kind of a perennial issue. We're going to have a rules fight at the beginning of session. Maybe they'll move past it quickly. Maybe they'll stop and fight about it. But this year, we're going to stop and fight about it. And we're going to stop and fight about it because there are some really big changes that have been sent out. So that is as brief as I can be, an overview of what the rules are, how we got here today. But that's my part so far. I'm going to send it back to Heidi, who'll keep us moving. But thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. So a little more context on that about why we're in the predicament that we find ourselves in the coming week. As the rules have become more contentious in recent years, some of these more concerning rule changes have been proposed and in a way that concerns organizations like ours, because they could really compromise the nature of our unicameral. And as we all know, we've got the only unicameral in the country. We've got to protect what we've got because we'll never get it back if these rules are compromised. And there are several things that dictate how senators conduct their internal business that really make our legislature unique, protect the minority voice of the legislature, and really keep it the special unicameral that we know and love. So this is why we're concerned about this kind of on a broader level, is many of these big changes would really erode some of the integrity of the unicameral system that we have here in Nebraska. Some of the changes brought forward are less about eroding our nonpartisan unicameral and really directed more at some specific problems that we saw in the last legislative session. Due to some really contentious legislation that was considered, we saw almost a session-long filibuster that really delayed the legislative process in ways we haven't really seen before, and frankly caused a lot of frustration broadly in the legislature and outside of the legislature. So over the course of this interim, there was a lot of thinking about, how were the rules last session used in a way to prolong this filibuster, and what rules changes could be brought to reduce opportunities for that kind of use to extend debate. So there are several proposals that came out of the Rules Committee, which convened on Monday of last week and had a 3-hour-long hearing where the public was invited to testify live, and the public was also invited to provide public comment on all of these proposals up to that point. So that was a new feature that the legislature provided for public input that we're really grateful for. I think in part recognizing that there's more at stake with some of these broader proposals, and that the public really should have an opportunity to weigh in, even though it's on the internal legislative rules and not public policy more typically. So the rules, the legislature started debating the rules last week. And what we've seen come out so far are those less controversial, more broadly supported changes to the rules that would reduce opportunity for filibustering. And I think there's less objection to those generally, but also there's been a lot of talk on the floor thus far about how there's a history of efforts to change rules to reduce opportunity for filibuster, and somebody who wants to filibuster is going to use that rule book to find a way around them every time. We have a long history of that happening here in Nebraska. These rule changes are not going to prevent filibusters. Where there's a will, there's a way. So, but because they are the rules changes proposed thus far on the floor are not really critical to the nonpartisan nature of our legislature, they're less concerning to us. We wanted to draw your attention to the handful that have come out of the Rules Committee, unfortunately, that we think could really change how the legislature functions in a way that the public would notice. And so we can launch into those here quickly. I wanted to bring your attention to the first one, which was introduced by Senator Erdman, who is the chairperson of the Rules Committee. This has been a long effort of his to change the cloture vote, or the threshold by which a filibuster is ended. So right now, our cloture rule requires a vote of 33 senators to vote to cease debate and take a vote on the bill. So that's a separate vote from actually the vote to actually pass the bill itself. It's more a vote to cease the filibuster that's been happening for however many hours, so a vote can be taken next. And right now, out of 49 senators, 33 votes are needed to end that filibuster and invoke cloture. So there have been, several proposals brought over the history of the legislature to change cloture because it is so consequential. If a bill is being filibustered, we know that it's controversial. We know that there's a strong contingent of folks in the body who are concerned about that policy. And one of the things that we've seen post-term limits is a real change in perception of how that extended debate is received. I think some senators have argued on the floor that, a filibuster is an opportunity to air grievances about policy, poke holes in a bill and address problems that they see in its ability to be executed in a way that solves the problem that it's trying to address. And that, in a legislature that's designed to allow, the whole process is really about bringing these people together to have these debates, that these prolonged questions and attention on legislation should not be received so negatively. And, I understand that folks are eager to get their policy passed as quickly as possible, but the way that people have received a filibuster, I think, has changed in recent years. And there's some in the body who really would like to shut that opportunity down. So the proposal is actually very interesting because the simple way to do it would be to just reduce the number from 33 to a lower number. Instead, what we see is sort of a sliding scale that makes for what I think is a much more complicated rule to manage. So one of the goals that I understand that Senator Erdman is trying to accomplish with this is he doesn't like the idea that someone could be in the chamber during a vote on a bill and not vote. We call that a present not voting. And so he would determine cloture based on the number of people in the legislature, in the chamber, voting on a bill, and that it would be, so 33 votes is 2/3 of the legislature. He would say 2/3 of whoever is present voting, which means that if the number of people in the chamber is reduced, the threshold for ending a filibuster also reduces in kind. And so, for example, if there were only 46 people voting in the chamber, that the cloture threshold would be reduced to 31. If it went down to 40 people present voting in the chamber, that the cloture threshold would be 27. and would go down to as low as 25 if 37 people were present voting in the chamber. 25 is just a simple majority vote. That would not be an elevated threshold for invoking cloture any more than the 25 required to vote to advance a bill to the next round of debate. So that's our concern, is that this sliding threshold really reduces the power of the minority voice in the legislature. And it's important to recognize that a minority voice can be, all kinds of senators working together depending upon the issue at hand. So, one of the strongest minority voices I've seen in the legislature is the rural senators representing their districts, when we see instances of, sort of competition over resources. And if we want, new and repaired roads in rural areas, sometimes that's up against urban interests. A really good example that I recall in my time in the legislature is the fight over consolidating rural schools, which was really heartbreaking for a lot of rural folks throughout Nebraska. And the senators representing rural areas at that time really banded together to try to represent their districts and keep those resources coming to their areas. And there just weren't enough to hold off that policy change. So for rural folks in particular, I think this cloture change is problematic because the rural voice in our Nebraska legislature is a minority voice. And because our rural representation, as the population of our state continues to shift to urban areas, it's only going to reduce with, perhaps every 10 years from here on out, which means that the number of rural senators representing rural areas will reduce likely over time. So I think it's to their benefit to keep that number exactly where it is. And I think a lot of the folks who are in the body right now haven't been around to see issues like that, to really recognize the importance of that rural minority in our legislature. So that's the cloture motion. The other concern that I see about that particular issue is that I can see examples where it could really damage relationships, and it could make emergency situations a real opportunity for some gamesmanship. For example, if a senator has an unexpected family emergency and has to leave the chamber to address something in their personal lives, suddenly we're at a lower threshold, and proponents of a bill could take an opportunity to invoke cloture and take a vote at that time, taking advantage of the change in number of people who are present voting. And I just see, there are legitimate reasons why a senator might need to leave the legislature, not all of them positive. And I just see that really creating an opportunity for damaged relationships in a way that would take advantage of a bad situation. So that's kind of a summary of our cloture rule. For those of you who are looking over here at our chat, that is rule proposal number 1 for those following along. And while debate on other rules proposals will start up again on Tuesday, we would expect to see some of these more controversial rules changes being addressed later in the week. Any questions about cloture? What do we have here in the chat? No, there's been no sliding scale as far as I know. Of course, we have our expert, Dr. Charlene Behrens, on the call. So if she knows otherwise, given her expertise, she's welcome to join in and let us know that. But as far as I know, there's been no sliding scale. We're hearing a chime in from the clerk, Brandon Metzler here, not only sliding scale, but sliding scale real time based on votes. Currently, the only sliding scale vote is members present. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so it can also cause some confusion about, the number of people in the chamber really can fluctuate a lot. So I can imagine that would be a difficult number to keep track of as the day goes on. And administratively could cause some hiccups. So I'll move on to the next issue that was kind of the one that caught our attention a lot, is that the proposal to end the private ballot on committee votes. So where you'll see this vote happen is when a legislature is convened, the first biennial legislature. Everybody comes on the first day and has nominations for people to chair each of the 14 standing committees and the special committees, I believe. And so people can nominate themselves, they can nominate each other, and there's a vote taken on the floor that looks like people, the senators are just writing a name on a little piece of paper. They hand it over to the clerk and the assistant clerk, and they tally it up at the front of the room in a way that's very public so everybody can see the count. And the folks who are taking that count, senators are doing that count, and it's passed along folks who are affiliated with different parties so they can verify that the vote is accurate. And then the end result is announced. So senators under this structure are not obligated to share publicly which senator they voted for. This is for, really, I think historically it's been to protect the relationships within the body. And the thing that it reminds me of, honestly, if I were trying to, explain this in a way that I think we can all relate to, is, if you're sitting at Thanksgiving and there were a vote taken publicly on whose food was the best, it puts us in a position where we're going to alienate people that we need to protect relationships with, and who in fact may cook for us again and do us favors down the road. And so creating a situation where feelings can be hurt that very first day of session isn't a great way to start a legislative session when these people are, it's such a small legislative body. They really need to work well together in a lot of different ways moving forward. So there's the personal aspect of it, but a larger aspect that really I think is worth mentioning is that the reason that the argument that people are making to make this a public ballot is that people should be accountable for their votes, and we elect our senators and we should know the way that they're voting. But I see a discrepancy there in that this is not a vote on a public policy. This is a ballot cast in an election for their colleagues, conducted in the same way that we cast a ballot in our election, and we're not obligated to make those ballots public. So I think it does warrant some privacy there. And from a public perspective, I really think that in order for all of us to benefit from the expertise that these various senators bring from their personal lives to the legislature, that there needs to be a protection for senators to elect people to these leadership positions who they really know to be best at that job because of the skills that they have, because of their life experience, because of their commitment to the work. And really those senators know that best because they're closest to their colleagues. And when they are influenced to make those selections based on outside pressure, often partisan pressure, we end up with, or can end up with, committee chairs who aren't as best suited for that work as they can be. And that's really a disservice, I think, to the legislative process, to the committee process, to public policy at large, that we all need to live by. So we get the biggest bang for our legislature when the system uses the expertise that it has available to it. And the best way to do that, I think, is to allow senators to make these internal decisions in a way that they know is best. So those are the concerns about the secret ballot. That's also a proposal by Senator Erdman, the chair of the Rules Committee. And there are any secret ballot questions where I can talk about that before we move on. I'm wondering if there are logistics between motions taken. Okay, that's back to cloture. We can cover that later. I don't see anything specific to the secret ballot thus far. So we can take more questions at the end. So I'll be reviewing those, but in the meantime, I'll hand this off to Rachel Gibson at the League of Women Voters to talk about a couple other proposals that kind of raised an eyebrow.
Thank you so much for that, Heidi. My name is Rachel Gibson, and I am the Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. Thrilled to be here to talk about rules, and I'm not being facetious. I actually really do enjoy this because it is how the rules get made about how we make law. So it really impacts things. So as Heidi mentioned, I'm going to talk about two more proposals that we're keeping an eye on, and then we'll talk a little more about, okay, we've told you all this stuff, now what can be done? What's the call to action there? So, but to begin with, the next rule that we want to hit on is a bill that would limit the introduction number of bills that can be introduced. So if you've been following the legislature at all in the past anytime, you'll know how many bills can be introduced, and there's no restriction currently. Any senator can bring a bill, any topic. There's no sort of, in some states, they have requirements by the party identifies which bills are going and which aren't. But in our system, because we're really focused on that citizen legislature, trying to get as close to the people as we can to do the best work for Nebraskans. If a senator sees an issue, they can bring a bill about it. So that's currently how our system works. And then within those bills, each senator gets to select one bill that's their priority bill. And so that kind of moves up the line of, in theory, working with the speaker to make sure that the hearing is done in a reasonable amount of time and that hopefully gets onto the floor for debate. Not all priority bills do receive that. It becomes a time issue, but that's the general structure we're working with now. We've had a ton of bills introduced the past few years, and that number keeps going up. We've also started to see bills that are very similar from different senators. So it feels duplicative because, again, the way our system is set up is that every bill gets a hearing. So there might be several hearings in the same, several bills that get hearings on the same day that are all kind of about the same thing, but a little bit different. So the idea behind this really is to streamline that. It also would, there's some pros and cons to this. One is that it would be able to streamline those types of things. It would, and again, the proposal is to reduce the number of bills from however many you need to just 14 per senator. So some of the pros of that would be that it would hopefully focus efforts. It would, make things run a little smoother, maybe encourage some folks to work together on similar types of bills. It would take some of the pressure off our incredible staff at the legislature who has to, manage and write all those bills. So that's some of the pros, and on its surface, it makes a lot of sense. But when we actually dig in a little bit and think about the cons of that, first of all, a community might have more than 14 needs. So if there are more than 14 problems in a community that a senator sees, they're going to be capped to have to pick just the 14 when maybe work can be done on all of them. The other thing is that there's another detail to this bill that once you dig in, it sounds like, oh, we're just capping at 14 asterisks. It also allows senators who only introduce 5 or less to pick 2 priority bills. So that's changing the power of how many people get their bills heard on the floor. It incentivizes some streamlining and maybe not a positive way. It provides more power for people to access the process than other senators working on other issues. So that's one of the other concerns that we have. Also, there are lots of bills that are small cleanup bills. So they might be tiny bills that are just changing a little something and it needs to be changed. It can make a difference in folks' lives, but is it worth the top 14? So there's a lot of concern there. And ultimately, it really comes down to this idea of who are we allowing to have a voice? Who is earning or gaining power, and whose power is being restricted or voice being restricted? So that's how we're looking at all of these rules. So that is generally, and that was introduced by Senator Hansen. What's interesting is that if you go back, and the league actually has a summary from last session of all the bills introduced by senators, and they really do vary. We have some that was like 7 and some that was like 40. A good chunk of our senators fit into that, some of them who are advocating for this particular rule. So just something to notice and think about. I'm glancing over here. Ooh. Oh, thank you. We are very lucky to have our clerk on right now, and he's giving us some historical context. They were limited to 10 bills. Senators were limited to 10 bills until the 1970s. And the committee bills were unlimited. So I didn't mention the committee bills, but that was another way that things could get kind of tagged as important. Yes, so this is saying now both of those would be limited. So without getting too in the weeds, again, basically this is looking at and saying who has power, access to the power to make something a priority, and it's going to be your committee chairs or people who are introducing fewer bills. Okay. The next one that I want to talk about is kind of a new addition. So this was one that didn't get introduced as out of committee earlier in the week with the other proposals that got let out in a batch. This one was voted out of committee. It has not been formally read across, I should say, asterisk there, but we anticipate it will be because it was voted out of committee. And this would keep the media out of executive sessions. So if you are familiar and watched the legislature, you'll see that the hearings are open to the public, to the media. A lot of times there are executive sessions that the folks in the committee meet behind closed doors. The public are not invited to have some deeper discussion, and that's usually when votes happen, some of the more nitty-gritty conversation. And again, in our state of Nebraska, because of the way our legislature is set up, in that we only have one governing body. So instead of a Senate and a House of Representatives, we just have the one. The idea is that the people, including the press, are that second check on power. And so built into our system, we need someone to be able to have eyes and ears on that to report to the second house. So we are not the only state, I should clarify, because I think I heard Senator Erdman raising this point. We're not the only state that has this type of law or open meetings acts regarding executive sessions in place. So it's not totally unheard of. And if you look nationally, sometimes that causes some problems because we don't get all the information as the public when they are, the press are not allowed in those executive sessions. The other piece I'll say is that we've been doing this for a very long time, and there have probably been times where someone's reported on something a senator is not particularly pleased with, but on the whole, journalists, these are trained journalists who are professionals and know how to report and give context to those conversations. It's not them coming out of those exec sessions saying, so-and-so called this person this name. It's really to be able to hear the nuance and the details and not just seeing a vote at the end so that the public can understand where that vote came from. It's the idea that we're getting more context from people who know how to help give that context. And so that is part of why that is so concerning. Yet again, it's another place that is asking the question of who are we giving power to, or who's losing power? And I would say that the public in that manner is losing some power because we're losing knowledge. I also just want to reemphasize what Heidi said earlier, because we've also gotten that before. A senator who will say, well, how do you support, having a secret ballot, but then you also want the press there, so it's not secret. This is the public's business. This is not about the equivalent of like HR, like how are we going to work as an office? This is the public's business. These are decisions being made about our laws and things that we have to live by. So that is the difference between these two. I think Heidi did a fantastic job of emphasizing that. So those are the two more of the ones that we are kind of keeping an eye on. Like I said, the 14, reducing to 14 bills, or 5 bills with 2 priorities, has already been moved out. It's folks have already kind of got their mind around it, that we're looking at that. The keeping the media out of executive session came up on Thursday, so that's a bit newer. Gavin or Heidi, did I miss anything on those that you would particularly want to highlight?
I think that,
Oh,
Gavin, did you have thoughts? Oh, okay. I think I'm unmuted now. I did have one thing to mention on the limit of bills to 14, and I think the clerk was mentioning this over on the side, but I wanted to make sure that everybody fully understood that point because it's an important one. That historically, there would have been a limit to senators' bills or committee bills, but this would signify the first time that there's a limitation on the number of bills introduced both by senators and by committees. And what we've seen when there's a limit on one or the other is that one kind of is the pressure valve for the other. So when senators were limited, but committees were not, the senators were encouraging committees to introduce bills for them that they otherwise would not have. And so this would be the first time there's really not a pressure valve for that. But as we know, when there's a will, there's a way. And, just gaming this out, what I think we could start to see if this were implemented is, once bills are on the floor and really moving toward final reading, that we would see more amendments at that stage of debate, trying to bring these sort of bill ideas as amendments onto other bills, and that we would be sort of in the cycle of germaneness challenges, because as followers of the legislature know, you can challenge the germaneness of an amendment or its relationship to a bill, that whether or not it's on the same subject matter, and that's subject to debate. And we could really get bogged down in the final stages of legislative consideration on some of these newer policies coming to the fore at that point that have not yet been vetted. So that could be a pressure valve that we might see if this goes forward.
I think that's a great way to think about it, Heidi, is that pressure valve. Several times on the floor, people talked about, what's the point of rules? And they are to empower the voice of the majority to be heard and the voice of the minority. And so what are these kind of built-in guardrails? When we think about like the bill limiting, you look at last session, and we roughly, in a weird way, but we did it, got about the same number of bills passed by including different elements in these Christmas tree bills and that type of thing. They found a way to do that without having to change any rules. So although this feels like a response to something that wasn't working, this is not going to actually address that issue. Like, this bill would not have really changed much about last session. So some of those pressure points, it's really saying, okay, is this actually going to fix what is at issue here? And is there another way to do that other than something that could threaten the voice of Nebraskans having to fit their needs into 14 bills or less, depending on the senator? Gavin?
I have one thought, and it's I'm changing back over to our media and exec point, just to bring up something that came up in some of this discussion about how that came into being. So years ago, media was not allowed in exec, but the members of the legislature were subject to open meetings and the Open Records Acts. So right in Nebraska, we have an open meetings requirement as well as an open records requirement. So you can attend public meetings. You can also see all the records of a government body. Also in Nebraska, our legislators and their business are completely excluded from open records. But in an exchange, basically, they traded protection from the Open Meetings or Open Records Act for the introduction of the press into executive session. In many ways, then this would be a step backward in terms of access. The public's not gaining back the ability to see the records that our legislators are working with, but would be losing some access. So really, on the whole, it's a net loss from where we were, no matter how you cut it, unless we stick with what we've got.
Thank you, Gavin. That is so helpful to understand the context and that we really, again, who's losing power, who's gaining power. And I also think that highlights how complex and involved and a history that this is built upon. And so that's why we're having a conversation like this, but also how do you translate that? So if we don't mind, I'll move to the call to action portion, if that's okay with everybody. And then we'll definitely have time at the end for questions. So as you've seen, there's a lot of detail and complexity here. So what in the world do we do with all of this? The first is to just contact your senator. And I would highly encourage you, even if you think that your senator might be on the same page as you, contact them, because there's lots of different conversations going on. And you just want to make sure that they know where you stand. What to highlight with them? Of course, you can highlight a specific issue that you've heard us talk about, but you don't have to be an expert. You can also just say, keep it fair. Don't, it's been working, don't mess with it. Keep things nonpartisan. Details are great, but don't feel like you have to be an expert to communicate with them that you want to make sure that all voices are heard. And Civic Nebraska has some great kind of summary pieces that can help kind of translate that into language that might be useful to communicate with. They will be debating these through Friday. At least that is what Speaker Arch has laid out. And so, call early, call often. If you live stream and hear something interesting, call again. But definitely get in touch with your senators, even if you think either that they already know what you think, or if you feel like your voice is not being heard, it's still important to reach out to them. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, this one's kind of odd, but talk to family and friends. Even just make them aware that there's a rules debate going on. And the point there being, hey, they're talking about changing the rules. Why are they talking about changing the rules? So that idea of we deal with this in redistricting is that you don't change the rules of the game to fit so that you win. You don't change the district boundaries to get the people you want. That's not how that's supposed to work. The same thing applies to rules. You don't start with the end in mind and build the rules to get there. It's that same kind of idea, basic fairness. So the third thing you can do is if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor, that's fantastic. And we've had some folks already speak to the issue of fairness, speak to the issue of rules in a couple of different papers around the state. We can also help with that. Civic is fantastic at that. So if that is of interest, stay on after the presentation portion and we'll dig in a little bit more. But especially in different places, helping to kind of highlight what this means. Heidi brought up the great example of rural voices. Is whose voices are going to be excluded because of this? Let's tie it to a person, to a place, so that it really makes more sense. And it's not just all the details of the really complex nuances of the rules. If you were listening earlier last week, there was a very long conversation about commas, which is an important conversation, but let's tie that to what the comma means. What's going to be the impact of that? Because there are real world implications. So overall, I would say, before I turn it back over to Heidi to manage our questions and answers, is that when we're thinking about the purpose of the rules, as was stated, it's to represent the majority, protect the voice of the minority. Minority means a lot of different things. That does not just mean party. Everyone at some point will find themselves in the minority, so keeping that in context. And that we want to protect our nonpartisan unicameral that works very effectively. We've avoided a lot of the extremism, I would say, in the past few decades as it's gotten more and more polarizing, partially because of the way our system is built. So let's not put that at risk for this session, because that gets carried to next session and to next session and to next session. So as Gavin and Heidi both pointed out, let's keep a hold of what we got, because it's really something special. And if we give it away, we're not getting it back. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Heidi.
Thank you, Rachel. Great points. We've got several questions kind of floating in the chat that I want to go back and address. There was a concerning proposal that was, honestly, when I read it, I laughed, that would have removed the requirement that the redistricting committee of the legislature have no more than 5 members associated with one particular political party, which essentially would allow redistricting to be managed entirely by members of one party in the legislature, which is, I mean, many of the ideas that Senator Erdman has brought over the years are because he's not a supporter of nonpartisanship or unicameralism. And so that would be certainly one way to end that tradition and making the redistricting process even more partisan than it already needs to be. So luckily the Rules Committee did not share his enthusiasm for that proposal, and it did not come out onto the floor for debate. So that's a bullet dodged. Thank you for the suggestion for talking points. We can share those with the group afterward. I did want to make a point about the secret ballot. There was a question about whether that was supported by now Senator, former Governor Ricketts. And actually the current political climate behind that issue is former gubernatorial candidate Charles Herbster actually had a pledge that he encouraged candidates to sign ahead of the 2022 election. And many of our state senators did sign on to that pledge. So there was certainly a pressure campaign to do so ahead of that election. Of course, I'm not sure how many of those folks are wanting to withhold or uphold that commitment, but this can be one of the problems with pledges, that it doesn't allow senators the flexibility they need as they learn more about an issue to be able to change their mind easily. And so that's one of the reasons why it can really be beneficial for a senator who might have signed that pledge to hear a lot from their constituents about how they feel about these issues.
Heidi, there was a really great question, if you don't mind me.
Please.
I don't want to cut you off. Okay, it's always hard to tell on Zoom. There was a really great question about what are some reasons that would be considered compelling to conservatives that might find this compelling? And my answer is because they're rules that would benefit them. Keeping the rules as they are, I mean, because at some point everyone will find themselves in the minority. But even beyond that, if you think about the way, for example, the executive bills situation, or the just put them together, the limiting bills situation, that is starting to funnel the power very much through committee leadership, party leadership, whether that, although it's not making it formalized, it is someone's going to be saying, this is what we need to do. This is who we should be doing these different things. So it's going to start funneling that power into the who already has the most power. It's just going to recreate that system. And so even, again, people think minority, they think party, but not necessarily. We're talking more about the funneling of power into a handful of individuals, such as committee leaders, such as, the leadership of political parties that may be in the legislature. So at some point, that's going to work against them. This provides senators to, the way we have rules now, without these changes, allows senators to truly represent their constituents and gives them some structure and some ability to push back some of those pressures. So that's what I would say. I don't know, Heidi or Gavin, if you have other suggestions about that.
Well, I would add that I think part of the reason why this conversation is sort of renewed at an unusual point, because usually we're not debating the rules mid biennium. We really shouldn't need to be having this conversation right now. But I think a lot of the interest is in response to how session went last year and this pressure that a lot of senators feel to make the process more efficient. And keep in mind, we have a large percentage of senators who are brand new to this body, have only served one session, and that was a really unfortunate one to use as their only experience informing their decision on the rules. So on one hand, I can understand how, given that experience, there is a sense of urgency about considering a lot of these rules changes as a way to shape things up. But, I think that's really missing some context. And Senator DeBoer actually made a great comment about this during the Rules Committee hearing on Monday night, last Monday, when, there were some claims that some of these rules changes were needed to shorten up these long hearings, tighten up the number of bills coming through the legislature and make their work more efficient. And she said, I had 23 bills up last session, and in their entirety, they took up less time in hearings than one or two other bills did. And, it reminds me, back prior to term limits, when Senator Dave Landis was serving, he was known for always bringing lots of bills, 35, 38 bills every session. And they were ready to roll. He had done his work. People were lined up in committee hearings. It was done very efficiently. And most of them were very consequential legislation. So it can really differ from senator to senator, how much resources of the legislature need to be spent on their legislation. And, that's kind of, I think, not been enough of the conversation here, is that a lot of the reason for this inefficiency is that we're seeing new legislation proposed that's never come before the legislature before by inexperienced senators. And it has changed the cadence of our legislature for sure. I think amending the rules is really a shortcut around that. That's not addressing the problem. And some some of the talking points we've heard on the floor thus far from some senators, I think really hit home about how the solution to these problems and these delays and this discord is really about a better understanding of each other, better communication among members of the body, and improving those relationships in a way that can get past some of these barriers. And rules changes, I think, are kind of a shortcut that are not going to solve the problem like I think people hope that they will. So we certainly don't want to see anything damaging to the legislature get passed. And so again, we thank you for your interest in this topic and for willing to spend some time with us this evening to learn more about these issues. Any other questions that came through? I think there was a question about rule number 7. And I know if Nathan Leach of Nonpartisan Nebraska is still on the call, that he has delved into that quite a bit. If you're available, Nathan, do you want to take the floor and just give a couple comments about rules change 7?
Yeah. So rules change 7. Currently, when you call the question, the presiding officer, so that's going to end debate and go to a vote. The presiding officer will ask folks, do I see 5 hands? And that's essentially a second. And it's really one of the very few times that's used in the legislature. Legislatures have moved away from seconds. They went out of vogue a century ago in Parliament, and they were the ones who made the thing up. So you don't see them in elected bodies because elected officials are representing thousands of people. And so if one senator says, hey, this is important, I want to propose this amendment or make this motion, they're representing 40,000 Nebraskans. It doesn't matter how much you like the senator or how much you don't like them or if you agree with them at all. Ultimately, they're representing their constituents. And so this motion or this change would require a show of 5 hands to introduce certain procedural motions. And this is absolutely, completely, I mean, it's shocking. Like that is 160,000 Nebraskans that would be deprived of the right to be represented by their senators. And then it would raise it to 10 hands for a calling of the question. But it really just demonstrates, I think, some of the falling away or lack of understanding of some of the basic principles laid in the unicameral. And one of those is the power of the individual senator to represent for themselves their constituents. That is a fundamental concept in the legislature. It's what nonpartisanship is based on. And so I think this one, a lot of senators or a lot of folks might not have really noticed, but I'm hoping that bringing it up and telling senators, it's not just, it's inconvenient to have this motion come up. Like this is the legislature. We're not talking about, an average game. There's rights that are really important that we preserve. So anyway, I could go on, but I really appreciate you guys covering this and appreciate all the others on the call.
I could listen to you talk all night, Nathan.
Yes.
Just tell me all about about rules process.
I've done enough talking today.
Oh, I won't make you do it today then. I saw 2 more questions in the chat, Heidi. One was clarification about which rules we're talking about, which I apologize because I was not very good at clarifying which rule numbers. So can you lay out the rule numbers that we were discussing?
Yeah, and I'll kind of rate them. We've had some conversations about this. I think different organizations sort of have different priorities about what they think is most concerning or least concerning in this list. But I think there's general agreement that the 2 most concerning ones would be cloture and protecting that secret ballot. So cloture is proposed rule change number 1. The secret ballot for chair elections is rule change number 3. Closed executive sessions to the press is rule change number 4. And the limit of 14 bills per senator for introduction is rule change 29. So of the 34, I think those were the ones that I think we all agree will change the tenor of our nonpartisan unicameral to a degree that's concerning. So if you are going to contact your senator this week, I think addressing any of those four are good. The most concerning ones that we see are numbers 1 and 3, which are cloture and the secret ballot. You folks ask great questions. It's so fun to spend an evening with legislative nerds like us. We need to stick together, and so we appreciate you being interested in this topic. Again, we'll start debate on the rules first thing tomorrow morning. It will go throughout the week. I think we'll be interrupted on Thursday with a speech by our governor, perhaps. But other than that, we can expect it to, I think, get more contentious as the week goes on. We'll start it on Tuesday with some of the less egregious, more neutral rules changes. And then I think come Thursday and Friday, we'll see the selection of the ones that we've identified as being more concerning. So there's time for you to make your voice heard, but I think senators will be discussing both on and off the floor all rules all the time this week. And so anytime that you'd be available to make your voice heard, I think is a good time to call or email. If any of you are willing or able or interested in taking a step further and working with us to construct a letter to the editor on any of these topics, we'd love to support you in that. So if you could stay on the call after we let everybody go, and we could get your contact information and make plans to follow up with you later in the week, I think that would be a great way for us to be of assistance to you. All right. Any last thoughts? All right. Thanks again to Nathan Leach of Nonpartisan Nebraska for joining us, to the clerk of the legislature, Brandon Metzler, who has his hands full and is handling it wonderfully. Lots of support to you, and thanks for joining in this conversation and really giving us your perspective. It's really valuable. So thanks again to everyone tuning in, and stay on if you want to talk about letters to the editor. Have a good night.